It's really a great pleasure to have this year, Dirk, as one of our keynote speakers, especially talking about learning analytics, which is a topic that he has contributed really some very interesting works, and I collaborated with him in the Learn to Analyze project, and I've learned many things from him, both me and my team. He's a chair of learning design and technology at the University of Mannheim in Germany, but also the UNESCO deputy chair of data science in higher education, learning and teaching at Curtin University in Australia. So in that sense, we are actually colleagues for the past 2-3 years, both part-time during that time. So I'm not going to say more. You can see his CV and his publications and everything on his website. He posted this on the chat area, and I will give the floor to Dirk, and he can decide how, if he will start slowly for more people joining, or if he will proceed with his presentation.
Thank you very much, Demetrios, for this invitation, and of course, thanks for the introductions. I'm happy to start whenever Marcus maybe also gives the green light for starting. So Marcus is nodding and saying, "Yeah, okay." So I'm sharing my screen, and off we go, I believe. So let's see. Hopefully, you can all see what I can see now. That should be the presentation, right? Let me let's organize this a little bit so I can also monitor the chat a little. All right. Okay. So I would be ready to start. So we have 27 people at the moment in our participants list. So I believe we have a good number of people we can interact later on. So as I posted in the chat, feel free to enter any questions in the chat, and so we can address these questions after my presentation. I try to keep it at 40 minutes or something like that, so we have enough time to discuss. So before I start with the topic of learning analytics, thanks to ICALT, thanks to the local organizers for making this conference happening in all these times we have at the moment. It's great, and I've been in the early morning session today, and it's just great to see the interactions and the possibilities we have through the technologies, but also we see all these technical flaws we have here and then not working well. So I hope this keynote will work well in this live session. So I didn't do any recording. So whenever you see any problems with the slides, please also use the chat so I can see that there's something happening on the technical side. So again, thanks for inviting me, and again for the introductions, Demetrios and Marcus, for organizing all this. And yeah, let's see what learning analytics are up to at the moment. So I'm trying to focus a little bit on the state of adoption and evidence of effectiveness of learning analytics, because yeah, we've been talking about learning analytics for about 10 years, and we've been doing learning analytics for about 20 years, or you may even call learning analytics for hundreds of years if we go into the era of schools. And this is kind of the learning analytics we've been doing for many hundred years. Imagine this teacher, he's basically monitoring the students, or at the moment maybe not really monitoring them, and collecting lots of data about the students. But also this teacher has data, of course, about the school, the context of the school, and exactly what's happening within the current lesson, and maybe also what's the plan over the whole school year, or even the whole life of a student at a school. So lots of data points, lots of different contextual data, which is meaningful from one perspective or from the other perspective. And this teacher is using it for, in the best case, to support individually the student's learning process over time. So the student will achieve the competence we would expect in a society to solve the problems the students are facing in the future on the job, but also in social and personal lives. So this is basically the data we've been, and the learning analytics we've been doing for many, many years since school is happening. But this is also true, of course, where all learning is happening, not only in the school context, but also in the higher education context, in the further education context. So whenever we talk about lifelong learning, learning analytics can be applied or have been applied in this sense of use of data. But this is the learning analytics nowadays. This is just a architecture we've been developing at Open Universities Australia, where I've been involved in for a few years, back in 2012, 2013. And this is just a short insight into the different data systems we've been using and how these data systems are combined in order to provide, again, the intervention and the feedback to the students. So, and this is kind of the state of the art where we are now heading to in the research domain. So my keynote today will be in 4 parts. First of all, I want to clarify some foundations of learning analytics. Then I move into research evidence towards learning analytics. Then I might address 4 challenges of learning analytics we are looking at the moment. And then I will show you some conditions which will support basically the implementation of learning analytics in the next few years, which I would expect to happen as quickly as possible. What we also see in our presentations at track 6 of the ICALT conference, Big Data in Education and Learning Analytics, I think there's some splendid papers included in that track which showcase the current state of the art. So let's move into part 1. So learning analytics evolved from increased opportunities, of course, to collect and make use of data about learning and learning contexts, which means that we have, of course, the digital data available, not only the classroom I referred before, but we have data now available in large databases, in different databases, and we are more or less able to combine these different data sets into some analytic strategies and then build some recommendations out of it. So this was kind of when we started, and I can remember about 20 years ago when I started using like groupware servers and looked into the log files and to understand how many students are assessing the files we've been sharing and who is assessing at what time point. So these were the first approaches of my own experience on learning analytics in my understanding. And then I addressed this information I received from the groupware server back to the learners and said, hey, you didn't, touch the files. Why didn't you touch the files, etc., etc. But nowadays we see something like learning analytics in the literature, basically on many papers. But we also see something like this. We see academic analytics, we see assessment analytics, measurement analytics, school analytics, teacher analytics, whatever you want to name it. So many terms around analytics, but there's no conceptual clarity. And that's the first issue in my understanding. We need to have conceptual clarity. What does it mean if we talk about learning analytics? And what does it mean if we talk about learning progression and assessing the learning progression, like in the learning sciences perspective? But what does it also mean in terms of data science if we talk about learning analytics? Is there a same conceptual understanding, or is there, of course, different conceptual understandings here? So if you go deeper into the literature, we find, of course, education data mining, we find academic analytics early on in the 2010s and 2011s, but also we find some initial definitions of learning analytics, and this is, of course, from Solar. This learning analytics definition, the measurement, collection, and analysis of data about learners and their contexts, which is, I think, the most important aspect here, which is very different to education data mining, which only addresses, of course, to extracting useful information from large educational databases and trying to understand that. So it's really the data existing and available, and let's see what's happening in there. But if we move into the current discussion in learning analytics, we might find something like this. It's analytics for learning, and it's referred to the same discussion we had in assessment in the learning sciences. So we had assessment of learning, of course, and now we have assessment for learning, which means that we support learning through assessments. And that's exactly the idea here in this definition, that analytics for learning uses static and dynamic information about the learners and the learning environments, which is, of course, the context of the learning, and trying to assess, elucidate, and, of course, analyze it. And very importantly, for real-time modeling, which means that whenever we do analytics for learning, it needs to implement the learning process. which means that we need real-time support, of course, of the learning process. So whenever the learner needs some support and help functions or interventions, the system can provide these interventions and functions. So we try to do this in real time or near real time, which is, of course, in most cases, problematic in terms of the capacity of our databases, but also of the capacity of the data we are collecting in real time. But still, we want to support the learning processes, but we also want to support the learning environments and maybe also the education decision making. What does it mean in terms of the learning environment? It means that we can support learning designs, which means that we can on the fly change our didactical approaches to learning, for example, or we can increase the quality of our materials and videos we are using in our online learning environments. We can increase and support a better feedback mechanism around self-assessments, or we can even increase our assessments. But also we can look at education decision-making for research allocation, for example, or for understanding how different study programs need to be changed in order to meet the requirements and demands of our society, of the job market, etc. So there's lots of possibilities around analytics for learning, but the most important focus is really understanding learning processes and, of course, supporting them in real time. So we can move on in this direction and find lots of benefits, of course, of learning analytics. And they've been documented throughout many, many papers. But there's some clear perspectives on the benefits. First of all, we have a summative perspective, which is just having data sitting somewhere and then looking at what can we get out of the data to understand better how the learning process was happening. So it's a more retrospective perspective. Then we have the real time, of course, where we really address the learning process while learning is happening. And of course, we also have some predictive elements, which means that what would be happening if you continue learning like this. So this can be mapped on a matrix like this. It's way too much to process in this keynote, but you can have, of course, the summative, the real-time, and the predictive or even prescriptive perspectives. And you can have different stakeholders. And in each of these cells, there's exemplar benefits we can draw from learning analytics. So if you look, for example, at the student at the bottom and the real-time or formative perspective, students may receive automated interventions and scaffolds. And that's exactly what I refer to into the real-time modeling and processing throughout the learning process. So this is where we want to go, and maybe also getting just-in-time feedback from assessments. I think that's easy to realize, but is that just-in-time feedback really informative for the student and bring the learning process further? That's, of course, questionable. And so you can go through all these benefits in these cells and get an understanding, where do you want to go with your system you want to implement at your institution? Because here's the context, which is important, and here's lots of aspects which are important in order to build such a system based on these benefits. So how does it look like from a framework perspective? We might have something like a formal learning environment. And that formal learning environment includes, of course, curricular aspects like the learning outcomes expected, the competence levels you would expect, which are defined by governance, which are defined by the institution and their strategies. And this study program, of course, is then well, put into units of study and, of course, sequenced throughout different semesters in order to achieve a degree or get a competence certified. This is, of course, then realized through learning designs in the learning environment, which can be an online learning environment, could be also a blended learning environment, or maybe also only a face-to-face learning environment, which, of course, makes our data collection more problematic. And then comes in our stakeholders, the most important ones, of course, the learners, and of course, also the teachers or the facilitators, if you want to call them like this. And the learners bring in lots of different characteristics. Each individual has individual dispositions, individual interest, individual prior knowledge, bring that into the learning environment. And if you have a class of 100 or even a MOOC of 1,000 learners, there are 1,000 different learner characteristics. And also, if you have several facilitators in a MOOC, or even having a teacher and some tutors facilitating a lecture of 200 students, you will have also different teacher characteristics, which you need to care about and you need to have in mind when you do your analytics. So all these different characteristics have an interaction effect on the learning environment, and of course also on the group interactions, but also on the learning processes on an individual basis, but also on group basis. So that's some important aspects you need to address here. And this information needs to be collected at some stage in different conceptual levels and maybe aggregated, maybe also limited in individual time points and sequencing in log data. And this is flowing into the analytics engine, of course, in this framework. And then out of this engine, you can do a reporting back to the stakeholders, back to the teacher, getting a report about the interactions happening throughout the semester, or even into governance or institution for research allocation again, to meeting other benefits for the curriculum. But more importantly, what we want is really the real-time aspect, which is realized through this adaptation engine, which helps to build visualizations, for example, like a dashboard where you see, of course, different flows of information coming through the teachers or the learners dashboard, but also building informative prompts, which means small hints towards the learning process. So it's analytics for learning, but also scaffolds, more informative ways of informing the student. This can be done, of course, automatically, but only in a limited way. From a pedagogical point of view, the most important way would be the red line back to the teacher, and of course the different tutors if you have larger courses, to get an understanding where are the individual students are flowing to, and what is the learning process and how is it happening, and then enabling the teacher in a more economic way to feedback that information to the individual learner to support an informative way and providing feedback in an informative way. So that's kind of the flow of a framework of learning analytics, which is analytics for learning. And so in a nutshell, basically, you can bring this down into 3 different profiles. So on the one side, you have the student profiles, which are the characteristics, and they might be static, not changing very much over time, like a learning strategy. You're always using your rehearsal strategy as your first set of approach to learning, or you use your organization strategy, you're marking important things in a text, or you're elaborating, which means you're looking for new examples and building links to other things you already know. And also dynamic parameters, which change, of course, over time, like your emotional state, which can be at one day very upset and sad, on the other day very happy and interested in moving forward. The learning profile is something different. This is exactly what's happening within the learning process. So whatever we can collect about the learning process, we would use in the learning profile as a dynamic parameter. So this can be the log file, the behavioral data within a learning management system, but it can be also through prompts, reactive information we collect about learning. So did you progress as far as you wanted today? That's also some indication about learning, and what did you do already? And so this can be also on an active basis collected from the learner if the learner wants to respond in the system. And then we have static parameters from the curriculum profile. Of course, this is the competence to be achieved. This is the materials linked to specific outcomes. These are the assessments linked to the outcomes. So all predefined in a learning design. And that might be also the benchmark, of course, to being successful in the course or not successful in the course. And of course, all this information flows into our analytics engines and builds interventions in real time, or even in predictive manners for the teacher, for the tutors, but also for the learners. So this is basically the simplistic framework each and every learning analytics system needs to implement if we have a formal learning environment. If you have an informal learning environment, of course, the curriculum profiles might be not existing here. So let's move on. Based on the foundations, is there research evidence on learning analytics already happening? And if you dive into all research which have been conducted over the last 10 years, we find something like this that's coming from a review on different approaches happening globally on learning analytics in 2016 or even 2015. And what you see here is lots of predictions of dropouts of students, students at risk, very much coming from the United States, and also looking at prioritizing interventions at UK, for example, at Open Universities UK, but also there's a project mentions at Open University Australia, which I was involved in. So different perspectives on research conducted in the early phases of learning analytics. Very common and very often used is, of course, prediction of materials flowing into pass-fail structures. This is just one example, looking at using different resources in LMS systems. This can be also MOOCs, of course, and then predicting, of course, the study success of a student. So these were the early aspects, but what you see here is really the idea of having data available and then predict something. So it's not really supporting the learning process in that sense. It's just giving a number or maybe an estimate. You could fail the course if you're continuing like this, but it's not informative towards how to improve the learning process. It's just giving you some indication. And of course, this is not analytics for learning in a very close sense. Also, we see lots of data analytics approaches. For example, what different algorithms might contribute to predictive accuracy in a learning analytics system. All these aspects are, in my understanding, very important for improving the data analytics side of learning analytics. So we need to understand, is a support vector machine prior to use, or is it a decision tree approach to be used within a different context of a algorithm, and of course with using different data indicators. And I come to this just in a moment. So for example, here there's 1 million enrollments in this study conducted, and we see that the highest predictor is the average historical grade. So whatever the person had an academic performance, and we have that information, that can help us to predict pass-fail rates towards the future of the learner. So a very important measure here. But also there's other things like method of payments, which might not make sense in the first perspective, but if we go into the learner characteristics in a deeper way, we might find also useful background information here in the method of payment. So if you use a credit card, you might have a different social background than a person using a check account, etc. So these are aspects which come from data science perspective, which are also very helpful in understanding, as I said, the data analytics side of learning analytics. But what else does research provide? So we've been conducting a review on articles published in the last, let's say almost 8 years. So between 2013 we started, now we are in 2020, we're still continuing this research. But this is a snapshot of 2013 to 2018, and we've been looking at specifically learning analytics articles which were supporting study success. So what is, how do we support learning and make, of course, people more successful in learning? So we found over 6,000 studies focusing on our first keywords, using, of course, the standard databases, but also looking at specific journals which are relevant for learning analytics. So in different iterations of our process, we narrowed down the study in a full text research into 46 key publications, which were included in our in-depth analysis. We needed to exclude many of the articles because they didn't include a clear focus on study success, but also they didn't have any data which were relevant, of course, for learning analytics, or might have had not a clear indication that there is learning analytics really happening in these publications. So we built a synthesis of these key publications, and this is just a snapshot. You can go to the publication which I referenced down here. It's open access, it's available. You can just go to the Springer website and download it for full reference. So the 46 studies we included, they have several things we need to address here. First of all, there's a clear indication in terms of where the studies have been conducted. So most of the studies come from USA, UK, and Australia. So this might be the lead countries, and that's of course also documented in other research. It's the lead countries conducting research, but also there's other countries like Brazil, Ireland, what you see here, Czech Republic, Thailand, where learning analytics is really coming from, and studies have been conducted. If you look at the sample size, we have a high variation in the sample size. We have very small samples like 29, but also we have large samples of a few hundred and even more than 1,000 students. So in average, we have a sample size of 15,000 students included, which is, in my understanding, very different to the classic learning sciences approaches, where we have only a few hundred students, of course, included. So that's, of course, a very specific element of learning analytics, that we have a large number of students involved, and we can, of course, also, or we try to understand the interactions of many learners. What is important is really here the operationalization of the study success measure, but also the question of interventions. And as you can see here, there's not many interventions included in the studies we've been reviewing, and also the operationalization of the construct of study success has been very vaguely or not done in a specific way. And so it's questionable if we don't have an operationalization of the dependent variable being study success, we cannot really have a robust study included here. And that leads me to the last column here, which means is the research rigor we've been reviewing for all the 46 studies, and we've been doing this in several iterations using different raters. And we had a rating system on the research rigor, meaning weak, moderate, and high. And what we found is that most of the studies have only a weak or moderate research rigor, which means they miss, of course, operationalizations of constructs. They miss a clear description of the data analytics perspectives, and also they miss implications for learning analytics and, of course, for pedagogical interventions. So to sum up all these more than 6,000 studies we've been collecting, there's, of course, more work to be done, especially in analytics for learning, which means if we address the real-time perspective, if we address the support of the learner in a way we would expect that they progress further in their learning studies and be more successful in learning. What we also did, in addition to this, we've been looking at more or less the same sample and identified, based on the student learning and the curriculum profile I've been addressing before, what indicators have been used here. And this table just quickly shows you that on the student profile, there's many indicators used, and they are kind of overlapping as well. So these are the data indicators out of these studies which are predominantly used in algorithms. This is also a publication just being published in the Journal of Learning Analytics and Artificial Intelligence for Education. It's also open access. You can download it. Just jump to the website and get this article to dive deeper, where we discuss all the indicators, where we discuss also how these learning profile and curriculum profiles, which are, of course, obviously absent here, why they are absent, and why people do not include curriculum profiles, for example, and indicators out of the curriculum profiles for using learning analytics systems. And that's kind of opening a big question. Why don't you have a benchmark like a curriculum included in your learning analytics studies, but also in your learning analytics systems, if that is the requirement? So big questions here, and that's a real gap of research in the learning analytics domain. Still, we have lots of indicators, especially in the log file era, in the learning profile era, where we have many indicators used over and over again, like content access, discussion length, trace data for engagement over time, etc., etc. So that's kind of the obvious data we get, of course, out of our systems, but they have also their limitations, of course. So again, lots of questions around the profiles and the indicators linked to the profiles and the missing cells here. We need to solve these open questions. Which leads me to the third part of my keynote, which focuses on the challenges of learning analytics. So there's 4 challenges I want to address today. Otherwise, we would have, there are of course more, but we don't have time enough. So the first one is, in my understanding, there's no wide, and that's also coming from all the studies we've been looking at, there's no wide-scale organizational implementation of learning analytics, which means that we don't have a holistic system already working and being researched, which is kind of connecting all these stakeholders and of course all the perspectives of learning analytics. We have lots of island perspectives on learning analytics, but not real system-wide and organization-wide implementation of learning analytics. And why is it like this? It's the capabilities deficit, I call it. And that's going back to a study, international study with over 150 institutions involved, looking at the capabilities they have in their institution on the staff side. And as you can see here, lots of red bars, which means they don't have the capabilities of a learning analytics specialist, for example. But also on the technical capability, they are lacking lots of aspects like the data warehouse or automated data reporting, and even interactive dashboards are lacking. So again, the problem of a holistic implementation of a learning analytics system is based, of course, on this capabilities deficit, but also on the organizational change structure. So if you look at the ladder of possibilities of analytics for learning, most of the institutions are sitting on basic reporting and reporting dashboard implementation, but they are not moving towards more or less the second last step, the adaptive and personalized learning, which is, of course, again, referring to analytics for learning. So this is something where we need to move forward and where institutions need to go to. And yeah, it's a long way in my understanding. But how can we reach that? We can reach that in terms of building educator uptake. And this uptake is making people interested in learning analytics in the first sense, and then making them wanting it in terms of seeing the benefits, of course. And the benefits matrix I've been referring to before might be a first step towards that end. But also we need to have the implementation capabilities, the tools and the data in terms of quality as well, but also informing research to have evidence that learning analytics are really working. And as you see, if the evidence is really weak or moderate, as I showed before, that might be a big problem for education decision makers to not go into the uptake because they don't see, of course, the benefits of learning analytics based on evidence. So all these strategic capabilities need to be included in order to move learning analytics into a more wide scale and large scale implementation at organizations. And it's up to you, in my understanding, to start this and start the conversation and build the uptake throughout different strategies throughout your institution. The second challenge is something in terms of the data we have available or we might need to make available. So first of all, there's an interaction, of course, of data we are using in our learning analytics systems, but also there's a fragmentation, which means we have lots of missing data and data we might need about the learner's characteristic, and that's a big issue. But also there's contextual idiosyncrasies, which means that data from one data collection point might be meaningful for one algorithm, but not for the other algorithm, and that's highly problematic. Or one algorithm might work at one institution, but not on the other institution. And I have evidence for this. So again, this is the study I've been referring for early on. This is 1 million enrollments at 8 universities. And as you can see here, the adjusted R-square in predicting pass-fail rates using the same algorithm is significantly different, which means this algorithm is working at maybe University 1 in a better way than, of course, at University 6. So that's the contextual aspects of these universities, which is, of course, differentiating our possibilities and the validity of our predictors and our algorithms. And that's a very important aspect here. We can also dive into the areas of study, and that's again showing the same, almost the same picture. We have algorithms working in one domain better than in another domain. Again, the contextual idiosyncrasies here are very important. So we need to care for the context where we implement learning analytics. And so we cannot use just one off-the-shelf learning analytics system and say that's now valid for everybody and for all, and it works for all. It doesn't, like you show here with over 1 million enrollments. Also over time, of course, I think that's obvious that if learning is, of course, progressing over time, we have a higher predictive power to predict pass-fail rates throughout the semester. I think that's obvious, and we are collecting more data points, and the learning is progressing towards the expected competence, and that's why we can predict better, of course, than in week 1 than in week 16. That's very obvious. I think still we need to care about this and need to include also in our recommendation systems exactly this transition of predictive accuracy here to not do a failure in terms of providing invalid information to the learner. So that's why the teacher needs to jump in place and decide as a last pedagogical perspective, is this information valid for the individual learner? Can I send it to the learner, or is it misleading the current learning process? So my third challenge would be the students and the students as producers of data used in our learning analytics systems. So if they are producing lots of data, but they are only passive recipients of information, which means we have a dashboard, being not meaningful and not informative for the learning process, we might use data in other ways, but not for the students. And the data should be for the students. The data should be for learning. And that's a big challenge for us. How can we build from a learning design perspective dashboards which are really useful for the learners? And of course, we can also ask students, and that's a study conducted with many hundreds of students, asking, are you willing to share data? And of course, students are willing to share data if they see the benefits, but they're also not willing to share data if they don't see the benefits. That's easily combined here in this privacy calculus assumption. So we have lots of information required for learning analytics, and there's of course always a concern over privacy of your own data you're providing into the system. But there's minimizing and maximizing factors concerning the privacy. So minimizing would be the system is transparent. The system provides you whenever you want information about the algorithms used, and you know that there's no third party using the data. Maximizing factor would be, of course, no transparency. The data is used in different other ways, and there's many people who can access the data. And based on this calculation, of course, you would make a decision on sharing your information or your data in a system or not. So opting in to the learning analytics system, or just leave it as is and not being part of it. So exactly this calculus needs to be included. And if you look at, of course, the EU data protection regulation, we need to have, of course, the learners always choose to opt in to the learning analytics system as a standard function. So as a standard way, we have learning analytics always not active, no data collected, and if the student opts in, then data will also be collected, etc. So the last and fourth one would be the difficulty to isolate the influence and use of learning analytics. Of course, if there is organizational change happening, there's not only learning analytics which is providing the change, there's also other factors improving, of course, maybe the whole learning environment. They use different learning analytics systems, but also they might implement a new learning management system. And that also improves, of course, learning or retention and achievement. And that's, again, the problem. What is really the effect coming from learning analytics, and what is the effect from the general organizational change? So we need to have more experimental studies identifying this. And if we go back to the systematic review I've been doing, we don't see experimental studies yet coming into the learning analytics domain, but also we don't see longitudinal perspectives in learning analytics research. So let me conclude with some conditions which can support learning analytics in future, and where we should move forward with our field of learning analytics. First of all, we need frameworks for holistic implementation of learning analytics. This simple framework of 3 profiles can help us to better understand what do we have and what do we need in order to build interventions which are meaningful for learning. The second one would be, we need dashboards which are informative. Not only the things you see above, like numbers, which are not informing the learning process in a meaningful way. We need to have semantic rich information, feed it back and adaptive to the learner's needs, which can be fed through a teacher, but also can be, and in some instances, also being automated. But we need to be careful in terms of automation, because if they are, of course, not trusted, then they are also not accepted. And on the other side, if we adapt too much the learning process, the learner loses autonomy for learning, and that's of course also harming the self-regulated learning, which we want to see, of course, and what we want to have established throughout the lifelong learning process. Third, and very importantly, we need to care for data protection. We need to have transparency within our organizations. What data is collected, when is data collected, who can access data, and of course, for what purposes we're going to reuse the data, and how long is it stored, and where is it stored, etc., etc. So many aspects which are, of course, regulated in the GDPR, but in addition, we need regulations at institutions, and these regulations need to be transparent to all the stakeholders. And the fourth one, of course, we need to have acceptance. Like I said before, implementation of learning analytics is requiring accepting the overall aspects, and this delicate list, you can go into this in more detail, of course, would provide us a good basis for having acceptance throughout the organization if everybody agrees to this delicate list and is of course involved in the whole process of learning analytics implementation. This of course requires change management, and the change management always starts with a readiness assessment, and the readiness assessment is looking at organizational readiness, technical readiness, and assessing staff readiness. And based on all these data, we can create an implementation strategy. And not saying from now to tomorrow we implement the learning analytics system and everybody has to use it. It's a slow process. Change is always slow, but change will eventually then meet at some stage, and it needs to be agile, in my understanding, meets the needs of the organization, because everybody's involved in this change process, which is very importantly here to mention. And last, and I want to address here Demetrios, who introduced me so nicely. This is our Learn to Analyze project, which is focusing on education data literacy. It's a competence framework we've been developing over the last 2 years, and which is important for all the stakeholders. So not only the student need to be literate in educational data, but also the teachers and the tutors, but also our stakeholders at the university who make administrative decisions. And if they understand how to manage, analyze, and interpret the data, but also apply it and understand the ethics behind it and the privacy aspects, and that would be, of course, the basis for being competent in using data, and of course then feeding back the data to the stakeholders whenever it's needed. There's a MOOC on education data literacy running freely, so jump to the website of learntoanalyze.eu and get more information about this wonderful project, which is still running and still producing hopefully wonderful results. So let me sum up. These are the 8 conditions for coming out of our learning analytics studies over the past few years. We need flexible learning analytics systems which cater for the needs of the individual institution, which is very importantly. Otherwise, we don't care for the idiosyncrasies of the institution and the contextual aspects. We need to test the data and algorithms if we implement learning analytics systems to make them robust and make them valid in terms of the analysis included. When it comes to implementation of learning analytics, we involve all the stakeholders, otherwise there will be resistance of change. And that resistance of change is, of course, a big hurdle of implementation, whatever technology comes into an institution. The question of organizational, technological, and pedagogical structures needs to be combined. So we cannot leave the pedagogical question here out of our equation in terms of changes in the organization, but also changes in the pedagogical perspective. So there needs to be some learning culture changing over time when we establish learning analytics. Again, ethical issues, data privacy. When is it okay to provide information about a person maybe failing a unit? Is it ethical to do so, and in what way can we do it? And is the algorithm really valid in terms of a data privacy perspective? So all questions need to be changed here. Then also, of course, the quality assurance. So if we implement learning analytics in our systems, is there a body of assuring that the algorithms and the data and the systems are free of bias, are of course maybe also they have an accreditation around learning analytics, which helps to provide secure information. What we really need is research funding, and I think everybody here in this talk would agree on this. If we dive deeper into learning analytics, there needs to be research funded not only on institutional level but also on nation level, EU, or even further research being international conducted, looking at cultural changes through learning analytics systems, etc. And very importantly, I can only motivate everybody here in this talk as well to build learning analytics communities and committees, bring people together, having the same interest, and trying to move things forward on a local basis, on a regional basis, but also national or international basis. We have our fantastic Solar Society, for example, which is doing a fantastic job here, but also we need the local things happening on that level. So when you want to learn more or you want to publish something in this domain, there's a book series, Advances in Analytics for Learning and Teaching, which I'm a book series editor of. So just contact me or consult my other books published also with fantastic colleagues on different aspects, but also on learning analytics. So yeah, this is basically the end of my talk. I hope I didn't take too much time and we have enough time to have an in-depth conversation. Follow me or write me an email if you have any questions, and thank you for your attention. And again, thanks for inviting me for this presentation.
Thank you very much, Dirk. That was a very interesting presentation. I think you gave an excellent overview of the state of the art today from the practical point of view of the adoption and the evidences you provided of what is working and what is probably not working. I'm sure that there will be some interesting questions as well. Typically, the questions I expect is related with privacy and things like that. So there is one question from Margus on, you can actually see the questions on the chat, so I can probably highlight some of them for you. For example, Margus' question is actually a valid one. How different learn to analyze learning analytics interventions can be based more on learning theories. I know that you have something to say there. That's probably one thing that you can comment.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump just in here. So I think that's a very important and valid question Marcus had here. And that's addressing basically my my comment on experimental studies and quasi-experimental studies we need in learning analytics, what we don't see yet. So looking at different learning theories or assumptions of learning, basically we could vary, of course, within experimental settings, the conditions, and then understand how maybe different interventions may have an effect in the learning analytics systems on different learners. So that's what we are exactly doing at the moment. So we are varying, for example, different interventions. We just conducted a last experiment before lockdown in a laboratory where we looked at instructor-based interventions versus automated system-based interventions and being more informative and being less informative, having different perspectives on self-regulated learning process like the preflection and the active phase and the reflection phase, and providing different prompts on these phases. So we are exactly doing this and using different experimental settings to understand what type of learning profile might be best for the learning analytics intervention. And based on this information, of course, we can then have like preconditions or profiles better defined and data indicators defined what we need before we can build interventions based on these profiles. So it's really a matter of understanding the system better and then building our indications and interventions around the system. So very valid, and I invite everybody to follow the route and really understand. We have so many understandings also about emotion, for example. We also conducted studies on, again, a quasi-experiment looking at how different emotional states are related to different learning analytics interventions. So if you come into a learning analytics phase and are very happy and if the system is prompting you to specific aspects throughout the learning process, but you do not want that way of learning at the moment, you want to go somewhere else, this has, of course, a very high influence on your current emotional state, and it might draw into, well, not doing anything at the day of learning. All these aspects are valid and relevant. So yes, I fully agree that we need more on these studies, and that's what we are doing. And hopefully we see more studies coming up in the next 1 or 2 years based on this.
Another interesting question is, thank you for this reply, from Ahmed. Ahmed is putting this problem of algorithms being probably not very useful in different contexts. So it's a classical artificial intelligence problem that the algorithms are probably biased by the context. So one algorithm that works in a particular context for taking any kind of decisions, but in this case for related to learning analytics, probably is not good enough for a different context. So the question is there, how we can develop algorithms that they can be generic probably to start with, but then can be adaptable to the different contexts and make it more effective for taking the decisions we need to take. So that's, I think, an interesting question to provide a comment. It's a classical problem anyway.
Ahmed, that's a wonderful question. And these two parts are very relevant, and we need to dive into deeper here. But from my understanding, it's really a matter of, we have a lot of information about algorithms and what analytic strategies with different algorithms work from education data mining and all the data science work, which is splendid in my understanding. And you know, we have out of the MOOC data analytics side, we have so many examples what is really working and what is not working in terms of different analytic strategies. Now we can really build, and also on our latest work, I've been referring to the open access publication on indicators. We get a even better understanding about what indicators are the core set of learning analytics indicators. And this core set of indicator could be what you refer to here as a generic context metric. And based around that, we add the contextual aspects of additional indicators coming from the institutional context, and that's again needs to be, of course, validated before we really implement it in the institution. But this could be the way how we start implementing institution-wide perspectives. But we are not there yet to have this generic set of indicators. We are, in my understanding, just started to understand that we need to build such a generic set and then build the contextual indicators on top of it. But this is exactly the way I see as a strategy, and that's maybe also going to the next question of Ning-Jing, to have a strategy for the institution. Having maybe this validated generic set available and then moving into the contextual idiosyncrasies of the individual institution, that would help everybody to jump or get a head start of implementation of learning analytics. But the second question is also very interesting, and I think it's a timely question you're addressing here, Ahmed. The openness. So if we have open learning environments, but still, I think we are learning for a purpose, and that purpose needs to be clear. And whenever we can clarify about the purpose, the competence we want to achieve, or the interest we have, that's also a purpose. That might be always the benchmark we need to address in a learning analytics system. And then the learning analytics system can help us to guide towards our purpose. Otherwise, if it's just, you know, something which is not clear, we want to achieve or we want to go to, that's always our motivation. We want to, you know, motivation means that we are wanting to achieve something and maybe get satisfaction out of this, this process. So that needs to be clear. And whenever we can feed that into a learning analytics system, what the purpose is and what our motivation is, then I'm a strong believer that we can use different data points to support the way we progress towards the achievement. So openness can also be addressed in learning analytics, but I think it's a harder question than in a closed formal learning environment. Demetrius, you're not unmuted. Demetrius,
can you hear me now? Because someone's muting and unmuting me, so then got him. So there are a couple of more questions there. If you would like to comment on that one from Diana, and another one on how we evaluate the learning analytics effectiveness from institution and from the individual learner point of view. If you'd like to comment, you have 2 more minutes before we close this session.
Oh yeah. Maybe we can go very quickly over it, and we can continue the conversation. You just email me. You see the email on the slides anyway. So Diana had an interesting question. Yes, there's publications. If you go, I can go back to this book. You see here, Utilizing Learning Analytics to Support Study Success. That's published by Springer in 2019. And this book has many different examples of implementation of learning analytics on institution level. So maybe you address this as time is short. I don't comment further on, but also there's a new book just being published this year focusing on artificial intelligence in education. That also have some examples in there. Yeah, there's a comment on, yeah, I fully agree on what Rivati also said as a last comment. The evaluation, building evidence for the institution is very important. So we have a formative and a summative component of learning analytics here as well. So we use all the data, but we also might use reactive data, collecting from different stakeholders to see if the implementation really works. It's a change management process which needs to be also evaluated. So it's an evaluative stage, and we can combine, of course, all data we collect in the learning analytics system. And on top of this, we can use standard evaluation systems and instruments for change management to add more evidence towards the success of implementation. But still, of course, we need to invest, of course, into learning analytics. Otherwise, we will not be successful here. I think time is up, right? So thanks again.
Thank you, Dirk. That was, I think, an interesting session for the almost 40 participants who attended it. Thank you very much. And I'll pass the floor to the technical team for setting up the infrastructure for the next one. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye.